Welcome to the Center for International and Regional Studies at Georgetown University in Qatar. This podcast series is part of the Energy Humanities Research Initiative. The project aims to generate new scholarly conversations on everyday lived experiences of energy.
Welcome back to Everyday Energy. I'm Vicky Googasian, and this episode is part 2 of my conversation with Santiago Acosta, poet and scholar of Venezuelan cultural history. In this second half, we speak about petrocultures of the Global South, ecological crisis, and why oil is the devil's excrement. We also get some great reading suggestions, so stay tuned for those at the end of the episode. Maybe we can zoom out a little bit because one of the contributions that I think you highlight for your work is that it can widen our understanding of petrocultures and petromodernity, which has so far focused somewhat exclusively on the global north. So I wanted to ask, how is the study of oil culture different, do you think, when it begins with the global south, or takes the global south as the sort of center of petromodernity as a starting point for inquiry, or with Venezuela in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I don't think that oil in the global south is experienced primarily as the comforts of modernity that are widely and easily accessible. I think, on the contrary, it is often experienced as a burden or as a curse, as they say. This is why we encounter so many writings and works of art that identify oil with, for example, the devil's excrement. That's a phrase that's coined by OPEC founder, Venezuelan guy, Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso. And oil-producing countries, I think, are usually plagued by all kinds of problems: political instability, economic dependency, environmental degradation, you name it. You could think of this, I guess, as something similar to what the colonial critics have theorized as the darker side of modernity, or I would say the darker side of petromodernity, right? So the violence and destruction that makes possible capitalist development as such, but which falls entirely on one side of the world, usually the post-colonial societies of the global south, and the marginalized peoples of the world, and nature, everything that suffers the negative impacts of modernity. So when I read about modern society's addiction to abundant and always available energy, I can't help to think of gasoline shortages in Venezuela and all over Latin America. A completely different picture. Or when I hear someone say that modern society is completely dependent on oil, I don't think of oil in terms of all the, petrochemical products that are available, or how plastics have shaped our relation to the world. No, what I see in my head is oil as this unequal international division of labor and of nature that sort of subjugates the extractive periphery to what I was saying, to the negative effects of oil extraction, oil trading, including environmental degradation, but also political and economic instability, while sending most of the profits and benefits and comforts to the global south. So I don't think that oil as a civilizational force can be fully understood unless we take into account that broader history of extraction and neocolonialism that is not limited to hydrocarbons, by the way, but goes back to the beginnings of the modern world system with European colonization.
Yeah, I really like your phrase, the darker side of petromodernity. I think that's a really helpful way to think about it. So thanks for that. Okay, well, maybe changing tacks a little bit, but I think one of the reasons why we're also very excited to have you on the podcast was because you're also a practicing poet. So could you speak a little bit about the role that oil plays, if any, or other forms of energy play in your poetry? Are you actively trying to engage in that project of representing this substance that resists visibility, as you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, it's not necessarily at the center of my project, but it's definitely something that, as I was saying, it's part of a bigger problem, of a bigger context, and that is basically the workings of the capitalist world ecology. In El Próximo Desierto, it's funny because I had to blend poetry and the narrative form to create this sort of hybrid form that made it easier to write about this and to imagine. What I did was write about several different scenarios in the future. I didn't do this in any systematic way, of course. So the poems are about many different things and they all tell the old stories. But in the background, there's always this type of dystopian setting. I don't know, I prefer to write poetry about these subjects in more indirect ways as a background that influences and determines the subjectivity that the poem's trying to represent. So in a couple of the poems from the book, I write about this world after oil, for example, about after hydrocarbons are no longer used as a form of energy. But I develop this scenario in which this, in fact, doesn't change anything fundamentally. For example, I say something like, I don't know, we thought that after oil society, that after oil, society would become more equal, the air would be cleaner, but this never happened. Instead, the state has become more repressive and violent. Here, of course, I was thinking about how Venezuela may be entering this sort of post-petroleum era, being that the entire oil industry is in shambles and the government is looking to expand mining and extraction activities into the Amazon and the Orinoco River basin, which of course is making everything much worse. My thinking here was that it's not enough to think about a future that supersedes the need for abundant energy in the global north, or that supersedes fossil fuels in general. That's an important issue, but oil as I see it is only part of nature, just one more part of nature that is commodified, extracted, and sold in the international market, and therefore it is part of a much larger structure and a much longer history of unequal relations in capitalism that also needs to be addressed. And by creating these types of backgrounds in my poems, I guess I was trying to suggest all these meanings, not in any direct, straightforward way, but simply as a small change in the context that completely defamiliarizes the world.
Yeah, I was going to ask you specifically to talk about the sort of role of ecological crisis in your work and the links between this representation of a world in crisis and these extractive processes. I think you've started to answer that question, so I guess I'll just ask if there's anything else you'd like to add on that topic.
Yeah, in my research and in my book project in particular, I write about those two types of works, of cultural products. Some visual artists like Carlos Cruz Diez or Alejandro Otero, who were, I would say, complicit with the extractive state to a certain degree and with the entire ideological apparatus of the petrostate, but in very subtle ways that are not usually, I think, recognized in studies about Venezuela. But on the other hand, there are cultural producers who, even when many of them, not all of them, but some of them were working within the same circuit of oil-sponsored institutions, were capable of elaborating a critique of oil capitalism, again, in these very indirect ways that we really need to read closely to notice them. Right? For example, I'm thinking of photographers like Ramon Paolini, who try to represent how Caracas, the capital city, had become a type of monster, of urban monster, an urban chimera, he says, after so many layers and layers of basically unplanned and spasmodic oil-funded development. Or the works of filmmaker Carlos Oteiza, who he filmed the thousands of Venezuelans who flew to Miami every day at the peak of the oil boom to basically spend all the extra money they had in shopping malls. And this documentary called Miami Nuestro, it's just absolutely fascinating. And he draws some very subtle parallels between that compulsion to spend and the way that oil's energy regime is based on continuous expenditure and the idea that energy and money are somehow infinite, and unlimited and always accessible. But these were not, I think, they were not really neatly divided fields. You can't speak here of two opposing teams of cultural producers, one complicit and the other more critical.
Sure.
I think the reality was much more difficult to pin down. And part of my work is to evaluate in hindsight how cultural production participated in all the changes that the Venezuelan oil state went through since the 50s until the mid 80s.
Yeah, that concept of complicity is really interesting in this context, because it, as you speak about, this is a kind of global hegemonic system in which we cannot really avoid some degree of complicity. But it's useful to hear you to make some of these distinctions about the different kinds of cultural practice that are coming out of that.
Yeah.
So let me move us a little bit away from oil specifically. This is a kind of forward-looking question for our Energy Humanities project here at CIRS, because we've recently become interested in the more effective dimensions of energy, another way of kind of tying this topic to lived experience. And so with that in mind, I was really interested in the first poem from El Próximo Desierto, the title of which I think translates in English, "Never Give Your Heart to a Nuclear Plant." And this seems to me to be about the kinds of deep attachments that we have to cheap and abundant energy, and also at the same time about the kinds of denial and despair, thinking about more negative affective relationships that those attachments cover up. So let me just ask you, what kinds of affects would you say are most important to thinking about the lived experience of energy?
Yeah, again, I can only think of this from the perspective of the global South, and specifically Venezuela. I think the first thing that comes to mind is that there's a lot of anxiety involved, mainly because of the issue of accessibility to energy. Access to energy is deeply unequal in Latin America. There are, for example, infrastructural challenges, economic distortions that lead to problems like gasoline smuggling. And there is, of course, the problem of power outages, electrical grids that are failing, hydroelectric dams that are failing after having, meant such a huge expense for these countries when in debt to build these huge dams. Back in the 70s, the World Bank was financing mega dams everywhere in the world. It was crazy. And now a lot of them, honestly, need to be dismantled, I would say, replaced by smaller ones or by solar and wind, who knows, because they're failing. And the research has proven that they can't be seen anymore as any kind of clean energy with such a huge environmental impact. But still, these dams, and I'm thinking specifically of the Guri Dam in Venezuela, are part of the national imaginary. They're an essential aspect of what makes people proud of their nation. And I think Rob Nixon says that dams are a sort of national performance art. The aesthetic of megadams plays a fundamental role here. So, I mean, at the risk of sounding like a pessimist, which I'm not, I can only think of these negative affects like anxiety, fear, disappointment, even shame. Venezuela is an oil-producing country that needs to import gasoline from Iran. It's a paradox. It's very hard to understand. It's very confusing, but it's something that defines the everyday experience of energy there. And you were mentioning my poem about a nuclear plant, and yeah, nuclear energy, we know it has a lot of potential, but it also has many negative impacts, and we have to think about where those impacts will go and who will benefit and who will get the darker side of that kind of energy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, what you say about the kind of dominance of these more negative aspects to that darker side. And so you think that even this kind of national narrative of fear and shame and disappointment, as you were referencing, that kind of filters down to even individuals' everyday experience of energy?
Yeah, I mean, I think in Venezuela, you're exposed to this every day. It's actually kind of difficult. The thing is that it's difficult to zoom out and make these connections that I've been saying.
Yeah,
You're
it's a
so
problem
immersed.
scale.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. A problem of scale. You're so immersed in the society that for so long has taken oil and energy and petrodollars for granted. Because there are these oil booms like in the 70s or even in 2006, and you don't think about it, and it's very hard to zoom out and see the danger in that kind of behavior. So you have to zoom out and you have to look at the geopolitics of being a nature exporting society and the way that power plays out internationally, but also how the world market and global politics have this kind of local impact that can be seen every day, even when you're in a line to fill your tank with gasoline, right? So you have to zoom out and look not only at space in terms of geopolitics, as I was saying, but also at history, this larger history of colonial extraction and domination of nature, not only by foreign powers, but also internally, like the issue of internal colonialism and the exploitation that the very Venezuelan state is doing, has always done, in the Amazon and in the Guyana region and everywhere, and the impact of all that. So it's really it's very difficult, and you have to really zoom out. Yeah.
Well, the last thing that I wanted to ask you to leave our listeners with is maybe any suggestions that you might have for people who are interested in learning more about either the petrocultures of the global South, or the cultural production of extractive states, or for that matter, any poets that you'd want us to have on our radar to recommend to our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first book that comes to mind is Fernando Coronil's that I mentioned.
Yeah, we'll be sure to make sure that's linked in the podcast page.
I think it's one of the best books about the subject, and perhaps, at least for me, I'm a big fan. So to me, it's like the greatest book ever written about Venezuela. That's how much I love it. Then you have Jennifer Wenzel's The Disposition of Nature, sure, which I really like. She's written a lot about Nigeria, and there are a lot of parallels, I think, between Nigeria and Venezuela, especially in the 70s. And there's also that book by Andrew Apter called The Pan-African Nation, about Nigeria as well, and the 70s in Nigeria. That was really helpful and during my research. And now there's people working in world ecology, for example, Kerstin Olof, or her writings about the zombies in Caribbean literature and film I really like them. There's Michael Niblett. His book just came out. It's called something like Literature, World Ecology, and the Global Food System. Very interesting. And then in poetry, I would recommend, I think, Raquel Salas Rivera, Puerto Rican poet. His book, Lo Terciario, The Tertiary, is very amazing about depth and value and environmental impacts of everything in Puerto Rico. And then I really like Daniel Borsutsky. His book came out a few years ago, The Performance of Becoming Human. It's an amazing poetry book. And then recently, Timothy Donnelly, his book, The Problem of the Many. I really like that one. Yeah, that's a good.
That sounds like a great list to me. Yeah, so thanks so much for that, and we'll be sure to make a little reading list for the podcast page, and to include your own work in that as well, for our listeners who might be interested in reading more.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, and thank you so much, Dr. Acosta, for joining us today. I think it was a really great conversation, and I hope our listeners will have enjoyed it.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.